Right now, we're going to be talking about investing in African startups. We have a packed panel, and I'm fortunately sad to say that Omobola and Marieme send their regrets are unable to be on this one, but we have a great lineup for you guys. We're going to be discussing the unique landscape of the African startup ecosystem and what can be learned from Silicon Valley's approach to venture capital. Coming out first is Kola Aina of Ventures Platform. We've got Michael Olugbeni from Lofty, and Soyomba Olamide from LeadPath. So obviously, when you work in technology, you have to be able to pivot, make some changes last second, which seems to be the case for this one. Thank you guys so much for joining us last second. Sure. The two of you happen to be around on the show floor. We're just checking out things, so thanks for joining us for this panel. So the thing that I've been hearing, granted I've only been in town for a couple of days now, but people are telling me that the Silicon Valley model isn't necessarily the best one for African startups. What are the major hangups we're seeing for that model, and what parts can't necessarily be applied to this ecosystem?
Who starts?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having us, despite the other changes.
We're keeping it exciting.
Yes, yes. I think the Silicon Valley model is a good start. I mean, yes, it's not the perfect, solution to all things innovation across the world, but it's a good start. And then what needs to be done is to modify it per the ecosystem where it's being applied. There are unique things about our ecosystem. Number one, and the biggest one, is that unlike the Silicon Valley, there is no slush of capital waiting to move in or to back startups. The culture of failing is not necessarily encouraged, or it's not necessarily in the fabric of our own culture and tradition. It's also true that the Silicon Valley innovation ecosystem rests largely on the universities, the academic, the research institutions. These are not necessarily the case here in Africa. And so what we need to then do is to build an alternative model that mimics what works in Silicon Valley, try to tackle the cultural differences, and is sensitive also to the needs of this ecosystem. The needs of this ecosystem largely should be focused on, one, job creation, which is very critical for this ecosystem. Two is leveraging local innovation in order to surmount local challenges. I call that social impact. And these are two critical things in the mix when you're coming into the African ecosystem. Unlike Silicon Valley, you can be looking at productivity because, of course, your economy there is much more robust and it's trying to grow. So startups that are in the productivity side tend to thrive better. So when I'm investing in this environment, I'm looking at what is unique here and investing along that line.
So headcount, employment is one of the primary things that you're looking at.
I think, the biggest difference for me is that there's limited sources of capital in this market. And so the notion that you can sort of burn cash for growth doesn't really sort of work in this market. Startups in this market tend to need to quickly, figure out, get to profitability sooner than later. And so, realizing that, it's sort of critical in this market. However, I think there are several lessons that we can learn from, the value that, would really boost our ecosystem. One is really what I would like to call a tolerance for failure, and sort of accepting that as a part of this journey, some folks will fail, and there's an incredible amount of wealth in that, that process of failing and trying again. The other bit as well is just how the ecosystem is self-sustaining in that there's folks are very willing to support and help. There's also what I would term a very high level of, sort of trust and transparency. I think the collegiate nature of the ecosystem also sort of helps with experimentation and sort of shared learning. And so, I quite agree that you can't copy and paste all those principles here, but there's quite a lot that we can learn and vice versa. Recently, I read an article about what the venture space in Nigeria can learn from the Alaba model of Alaba Computer Village, rather, is of where folks are sort of like in an internship model, and then they get funded by their, in quotes, master. I think just looking at those local sort of models of internship and funding, and figuring out how we might incorporate some of those principles into how we do venture here would probably result in something a lot more localized.
Do you feel, though, that there is some of that collegiate spirit? I mean, especially given the fact that it is a relatively small market, so everybody, I assume, is in it together, or are people more competitive because it's a smaller market?
So, I mean.
Well, I think what we've seen, if I take the first question leading to the second, is in terms of funding and copying the Silicon Valley model. I'll talk about our example. We quickly found out that if we even look at Y Combinator or some of the big accelerator programs, we started out with an accelerator program. So the whole idea being, come in for 3 months, we work with you for 3 months, and then have a demo day and put you in front of bigger investors who can write larger ticket sizes. So we were investing between 25K to 100K. But we quickly found out that in 3 months, even in our market, you're just even getting started. In 3 months here, maybe a company that's trying to partner with a telco has probably been trying to partner with that telco for 2 months and trying to get some meetings. So you find out that many of the companies that we wrote checks, or that we write checks for, or that we're writing checks for when we're operating the accelerator model, we had to write a first seed and then a second seed in those companies, because the bigger ticket investors weren't just there at the time. So what a group of people started doing was to bring a bunch of people together. So I write a 50K check, Kola can write a 50K check, and we bundle that and give to a single founder that allows him scale. Because you always find out that, especially in our market, you find some of the bigger ticket investors say, I like this company, but it's a bit too early.
Yeah.
And the seed stage guy has written 25K checks 2 times, and it's like, well, I'm maxed out. So there's that growth fund gap that a bunch of angel investors coming together can fill. Whereas in the Silicon Valley type, one single investor would typically write that check.
So I mean, to your point, I mean, it is a small sort of investing and startup ecosystem, so everyone sort of knows everyone. But I think we can among startups, I think there's room for a lot more sort of maybe mentorship, founders mentoring founders, and just more sort of a lot more of that collegiate spirit. And I think it stems from the fact that the ecosystem in the Valley, for instance, is based off of colleges and universities, and so that spirit sort of transfers into the whole process of building companies. We don't quite have that here.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up this idea of kind of a long runway. That is something that we're used to seeing. I don't know that it's necessarily the best idea. A lot of times these companies spin their wheels for a really long time. When you're looking at early stage companies to invest in, how important is profitability and how important is speed to profitability as far as where you're actually spending your money?
I would say very important.
Yeah.
I think because you recognize that the conveyor belts for funding isn't as developed as in other markets, you want to ensure that at least the company can sort of reach a profitability in, say, 12 to 24 months, or as the case may be. And then,
so 2 years is sort of your deadline in most cases.
I agree. I mean, you're not gonna in this market, you're not gonna have a lot of investors chasing after a company that is loss-making over a long period of time. But what we try to strive for in Lofting Capital Management, in our fund, both in the pilot fund and in the new fund that we're currently investing, is what I call unit cost profitability, right? So I'm looking from the perspective of how you're selling each of your products and if you're making money on each of them. Now, I do understand that you need to invest for incremental growth. And I expect that those incremental growth investments will come from either us or follow-on funders. For the Afropreneur Fund, which we are currently investing in, is to occupy the space which Olumide talked about. There's a lot of people that can get money up to $100,000, and then we realize that between 100 and a million, there's not a lot of investors there. Yeah. And then after 1.5, everybody wants you, right? So you have this, what we call the valley of debt. How do we bridge that valley of debt is what I hope we are trying to answer. But in selecting, we realize that we're actually quite spoiled for choice. There's a lot of companies in that gap, and there are very few growth capital, early to growth capital fund managers in that gap. So you are really spoiled for choice. So profit is a key metric which we use to separate the men from the boys.
I mean, if you're lucky, there's overlap in greater good and profitability. Are you making sure, though, that there are a certain number, do you have a certain percentage, kind of almost pet projects for this greater good side of things?
I mean, I think there is room for sort of investing in things that may not, reach positive unit economics within that time frame.
It's nice to know that you're doing some good in the world, right? If you can.
Absolutely. I mean, you do that, right? But again, it boils down to the value of debt that he referred to, right? Is if you're an early stage seed investor, you're gonna write the first 50 to 100K check, and you want to ensure that the company sort of has all the dynamics that would make it attractive to the next person on the pipeline, and it's like it's a catch-22, right? Is it too early or not early enough? And that's the debate that constantly happens in this market. So
if I could add to Kola's point is when you're investing in some of the companies in our market, right? Especially when you think about exits, even in our space. What we've started to look at more is, even in our market where there's no late stage or there's no slush of late stage funding, who can do acquisitions in our market right now today? You have probably the bank and the telcos who are large enough to do acquisitions. So necessarily funding a pet project of someone, and you're thinking down the line, who's going to come down to continue to take this off me from a seed stage investor point of view? If it's what we found very interesting is building out and funding interesting companies that find ways to collaborate with the large corporates who we have access to, and then become of value to those corporates and become even acquired down the line.
So it sounds like it's important to do more than just be the ones cutting the checks. I mean, you see a promising company, you don't necessarily see a quick path to profitability, or at least maybe they're not taking that initiative. So are your individual companies really kind of taking the time to walk these early stage startups through those initial parts of the process?
I think there's a lot more that you have to do in this market beyond just writing that check. So I mean, business development is one key sort of value add that you can add as an investor. So helping with the telco relationships, the bank partnerships, because these sort of large corporates, have access to distribution. And so that becomes really critical because markets are not as organized. There's also, regulatory issues that companies contend with, and just sort of having the bandwidth at that level to help navigate some of those issues becomes extremely valuable for companies in this market.
I mean, as I said, in this market, you really will be dangerously investing if you're just thinking you're just going to write a check and go to sleep, right? I mean, when you do a pest analysis of any of your startups here, you really, really have to watch the P, the E, the S, and T, period. Now, what we do discover on our side is that profit for purpose, which is, say doing well while doing good, is good. It's an it's a great differentiator for founders who have been able to design business models that leverage on the bottom of the pyramid. So yes, we are interested in founders solving real world challenges, the triple bottom approach. You want them to be sustainable. I always repeat that as a first criteria. Being sustainable means financially, these companies can sustain themselves. Unit cost profitability. That's very important. But we also want to make sure they are creating jobs and they are also solving and resolving critical social challenges, speaking to the larger majority of the market. The previous speaker during the fireside mentioned the fact that this is ultimately a country, for example, Nigeria, 70-75% poverty rate. So if you are selling to the poor, you stand a greater chance of actually pulling the volume and the necessary revenue growth you need year on year to sustain your business. So I'm interested in companies that are selling to the poor as much as I'm interested in companies that are making profit. So I'm looking at it not just in terms of being able to make profit now, but how to scale the profit. So being able to scale profit also means being able to actually look at purpose. So profit for purpose is the way I would put it. So it's not entirely, it's not binary. It's not either or. It's not either I look at profit or I look at purpose. But I want to look at profit for purpose. So that's one. On the other hand, mentoring companies and holding their hands through the critical challenges of growing in this unique market is one of the key hallmarks of check writers that actually make a lot of money in the long run. You will get called in the wee hours of the night about regulatory issues. You will get called about calling somebody on the political side. You will get calls about opening markets, strategic partnership with big companies. Big companies are difficult to reach here. They're not very much unlike what you get. No, you not just open that door. So it's very important for us to do those things.
I mean, that brings up an interesting topic. Do you feel, the impression that I get, again, very sort of cursory and not having been here for very long at all, that there aren't a lot of venture arms for larger companies, that the sort of the larger telecoms, technology companies, just companies in general that are native to the area or Africa larger aren't doing as good of a job doing VC and investing in these companies. Do you find that to be the case?
I think that's starting to change. Before now, the leaders of these companies would invest individually, but the corporate venture activity certainly wasn't where it ought to be. We recently announced a corporate venture fund working with the US-Nigeria Council, and that's ramping up pretty well. And the idea around that is to essentially get more corporates involved, because that's how you start to sort of build velocity for exits down the road, because these corporates then sort of are good candidates for M&A activity. But I think corporates historically have taken a more, I would say, aggressive, competitive position when they look at startups. But that is changing, that is evolving. I think there's more education.
I think it's changing, and I think we're also seeing a lot of copycat and fear of missing out syndrome, especially in the corporates.
Once a couple of companies do pretty well, then everybody...
They find out that, okay, one company has set up an innovation lab somewhere, and then they just think it's about setting up the innovation lab. Or one company has put something out in Yaba, and then the other bank or the other telco is saying, I need to do the same thing. So the corporate venture, they still find themselves even still lagged with the corporate bureaucracy, even when they come into that space. So that's why corporates partnering with the likes of Ventures platform is a smarter way to doing this, because you have access to the ecosystem and you can employ that corporate capital in a better way, as opposed to just having an innovation hub or an innovation space as a corporate just for the fact that it's cool and it's a nice thing to do.
I think it's a new R&D. I mean, again, we have to understand the uniqueness of this ecosystem. The reason why accelerators like Ventures, Innovation, CCO, all of these accelerators are common here is because somewhat of a failure of the education system. So the education system has failed to prepare our innovators, our young minds, to create things to actually solve problems in this environment. So here in steps the accelerators and incubators. Now, in that context, a lot of corporates have missed out with connection to the academic community. Now they find these accelerators, incubators as alternatives to the universities, research institutions, which are normal across the world. So I think a lot of them are realizing that, well, we've been missing a connection with the academic community, but these other alternatives now exist. And a lot more awareness, I think, is the reason why you're seeing more of them coming in to partner instead of competing or trying to create competing hubs, which definitely they're not experts in running hubs. You are a bank, you are a fintech company or a telecom, you want to focus on running your telecommunication company, and you put money and know-how, expertise, mentorship behind people that actually do that on a 24/7 basis. I think you can get a whole lot more results than just doing it yourself.
I mean, you guys just launched something with FCMB recently in the agri space. We're doing something with ARM in the finance space. And so I think you're seeing a lot more of that activity happening. Sure. And it's a really good access point for the kinds of partnerships that can help startups scale.
It's sort of a snowball, like a cascading effect. Once something happens, everybody gets interested. Unfortunately, we don't have Omobola here, and I feel like she probably could have spoken to this as well as probably anybody on Earth. Are local governments doing enough to foster innovation?
What, sorry?
Are local governments doing enough to sort of foster innovation?
I don't want to call out local governments here, but
let's just say governments. Maybe it's easier.
Yeah.
Okay, so you saw the laughter, right? Because there's really nothing like local governments.
Well, I think, I mean, when you talk about government in general, I think there is certainly an increased level of awareness of the value and the sort of the strides of this ecosystem, and that in itself, I think, has some value. There's been a few. The vice president, for instance, has visited a number of hubs. But I think what we need to see more is a move away from talk to more action and getting things done. And so there's conversations around creating incentives for local investors, so you can see a lot more Nigerian capital actually supporting startups, and I think that starts to unlock. And those conversations are ongoing. So I would say I'm sort of glad to see the interest, but we need to convert all that interest to action. And there's been support. I mean, the hubs have been supported to an extent, but just seeing more quantum leaps in terms of what government actually does support the ecosystem will be critical.
Yeah, and even I think at the state level too, we have some states that have been quite forward. Lagos State, for example, came up with the Lagos Innovates program under LSETF, which is helping startups with vouchers to go and work out of hubs, coming up with programs for enablement. So at the state level and at the federal government level, there's some action happening. But like Kola said, we need to, and even I think the onus also lies with some of we early local investors to do some of that evangelism and getting them to see that, to unlock more local capital.
There's also a presidential advisory group that's doing a lot of engagement with governments, and that's a first. I don't think we've ever had that level of engagement. And so, knock on wood, hopefully in the next couple of years we can see some.
So obviously, best case scenario, you have local companies investing in local companies, but you also want some outside capital as well. You want essentially as much money being injected into the system as possible. If you're having a conversation with somebody outside, say somebody from the Silicon Valley or another area, what would you tell them? Why would you tell them that Nigeria, Africa in general, are good places to spend your money?
Yeah, I think the proposition is very direct. I mean, this is the new frontiers. I mean, if you want an outsized return on your capital, then you need to be in Africa. Africa also is young, the population is young, so if you want innovation to actually solve real practical challenges in the immediate local environment by the people that live in that environment, then you should back an African startup. I think we are beginning to see the rise of African startups that are actually global. That means they have a global mindset, but they're working locally. I do think in the next couple of years, we will start seeing African companies actually go public internationally and actually do things internationally outside of Africa. So I think it's the right time to be in Africa, so to say. And I think if you want to make an outsized return, you need to be in Africa.
I mean, I think the demographics, you either see them as extremely compelling or extremely worrying. Nigeria by 2050 is forecasted to have over 400 million people, and about 60 to 70% of those people are going to be young people. And so, as efforts happen to sort of scale up financial inclusion, scale up education, and as hopefully incomes levels start to rise, companies that, have sort of figured out how to deliver goods and services to, folks at an affordable, effective cost really start to unlock a lot of value. But I don't think Africa is for every investor.
Yeah.
I think the investors have to sort of be willing and prepared to sort of learn the local nuances and sort of sort of perhaps collaborate with folks on the ground that understand the lay of the land. Nigeria or Africa is not where I don't think it's the way you fly in and fly out, helicopter invest, except you invest in like a YC that would take you into an accelerator, but ultimately would also like to have some local investors in the round as well to provide local support.
I'm sad to say, actually, we got 0 on the clock, so we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for joining us last second. So we're going to actually take a quick break right now, and we are going to be back with the Startup Battlefield Final in a few minutes. We also have a lot more great programming coming up, and after the show, the Mall for Africa closing reception is happening right outside of these doors over there. So everyone be back by 3:40 for the Startup Battlefield Finals, and thanks so much to these gentlemen for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. That was great.
Really good.
Yeah, really. Yeah.